Continuing our reading in Abraham Hannibal and the Battle for the Throne by Francis Summers Cox. Today we'll finish the book with chapter 24, Victory and Afterward. And so as the sun blazed down from high in the hazy blue sky, some 8 hours after the battle had started in the first light of dawn, the Swedish drummers beat the signal to retreat. The Swedish army and the Swedish king retreated back to their camp, leaving only their dead, their wounded, and their prisoners on the battlefield of Poltava. Little by little, the echo of the last shots and the sharp smell of gunpowder faded from the hot air, and the swirls of dust and smoke settled. Peter waved his hat in the air, the hat with a Swedish bullet hole in it, and called out from his stallion, "All merciful God has granted us victory. The enemy has been well and truly knocked on his head. Let all able-bodied troops come together and give thanks to God." And as the dead and wounded were carried into the fort, thousands of Russian troops gathered in front of it, filthy from gun smoke and blood and dust, the cavalrymen standing by their heads of their panting and exhausted horses, holding their bridles, soothing them, and a priest led the army in prayers. Then Peter announced, "All men at ease! Back to camp and dinner." And the troops all gave a great cheer. But there was one person who was not ready to leave the battlefield of Poltava till he had got some answers. Abraham had kept near Peter's side since the end of the battle, waiting to speak to him. The Tsar was just about to mount his stallion and ride with his generals into the fort, and Abraham was thinking fast about how to attract his attention, when Peter suddenly noticed him. "Aha, my young African! I've seen fine work from you these last days." "That's what I would like to speak to you about, Your Majesty. Have I shown myself worthy of your trust?" "Abraham, Russia owes you a debt. You provided most valuable news from the Swedish camp, and at a considerable risk to yourself. That was a brave and well-planned act, and I promised you it would be rewarded." "And in the battle?" The Tsar looked down at him, a strange half-smile on his face. "I think I noticed gunner Abraham defending a cannon against Swedish attack, and then manning it in fine style. I have a feeling that your days as a drummer boy are over, and your days as my servant, too, for that matter." Abraham's eyes widened. I'm no longer a servant? I'm no longer a servant?" Suddenly he was conscious of all the princes and generals standing around him, and the Tsar watching and waiting silently. The thousands of troops behind them were not silent or still, but they were waiting too, waiting for the Tsar to enter the fort before they did. Abraham tried to clear his throat. It was very dry. It would be one of my dearest wishes to serve your Majesty as an officer in the Russian army." The Tsar laughed. "Fine, and what might your other dearest wishes be?" "Your Majesty, long ago I left my country on a mission to the Sun King. I still hope to fulfill my mission, to visit the Sun King's court and deliver greetings from the Emperor of Ethiopia." "Well, I think that wouldn't be too hard to arrange. Let's see, your officer training can begin here, and at a suitable time we can send you to France for further studies. You have a gift for building and engineering, and the French lead the field in the building of fortresses. I feel that if you specialize in that, you'll be bringing a valuable skill to Russia. And while you're in France, by all means, let's have you presented to the French court." The Tsar put his huge hand on Abraham's shoulder. "You know, Abraham, that was one of my better ideas, I feel, removing you from the Sultan's palace. African or not, you are a better Russian than many a Russian I've known. Thank you for what you've done for our country. I'd like to see you go far here in my Russia. After all, we've had plenty of Scottish and German generals in our army. Why shouldn't the Tsar's African make it to general one day? Eh, Abraham?" Abraham felt his cheeks go hot, but he nodded as calmly as he could. And then, as the Tsar swung himself up on his horse and rode off with his generals toward the dinner in the fort, Abraham looked around at the battlefield of Poltava, still choked with soldiers and horses, bodies living and dead, and scattered with a mess of abandoned cannon, banners, swords, and muskets. He looked around at the earth, the grass and the bushes soaked with blood and smudged with soot. Somewhere off to the south was what was left of the Swedish army, was frantically getting ready to escape south toward the empire of the Sultan. Abraham felt almost suffocated by the strength of his feelings. Well, the Battle of Poltava is over. Sweden really has been knocked on the head for a long, long time. We've won, I've won. It's a new beginning for Russia and for Tsar Peter, and a new beginning for me. Lahea, you always said if you wanted something badly enough and don't give up wanting it, you'll get it in the end. Soon I'll be in France, and at last the Sun King will see what us Ethiopians are made of. As the lines of troops piled in through the gates of the fort for their dinner, Abraham stood very still, looking out over the blood and filth and mess of the battlefield, and whispered under his breath the French words he had learnt so long ago. My name is Abraham, and my father is a noble lord of Africa. The Emperor of Ethiopia sends brotherly greetings to the King of the Franks. And that's the end of the book. The afterword reads, Abraham was a real person. He himself wrote how his father was an African prince, and how he was taken from his home in Istanbul when he was a little boy, and then to Russia. His family used to describe him weeping as an old man when he remembered his favorite sister drowning in the sea as his ship sailed away from the coast of Africa. Some of the details of this story are made up, but many of the characters really existed. The Emperor Jesus the Great of Ethiopia, Dr. Ponset, the King of Mecca, and his raiders, who really did kidnap the Ethiopian children on their way to France, King Louis XIV of France, Peter, Tolstoy, Fatih Sava, King Charles XII of Sweden, and of course, all the Russian family. Elizabeth is based on a real person too, a French girl named Amy. Another real person was the famous general Abraham Hannibal, who was buried near Istanbul. Abraham took his name as a surname when he was older. Abraham really did get to France in the end and meet the Sun King's great-grandson, Louis XV, but he didn't spend his life there. He became an officer in Tsar Peter's favorite regiment and worked mostly as an engineer, designing fortresses and canals. He also tutored the next Tsar, the young son of Prince Alexis, in maths. Tsar Peter managed to start turning Russia into a strong and modern country, and St. Petersburg, Peter City, really did grow out of a swamp to become one of the loveliest cities in the world. When Peter and then Catherine died, Abraham lost his two most powerful friends, and he spent 3 terrible years exiled in Siberia. After that, life began to improve, and he became a general in the army, governing the Russian troops in the port city today called Tallinn. He also became a very rich landowner. Abraham got married twice and had a large family. One of his sons, Ivan, became a famous general and admiral. Another of his sons, Osip, had a daughter, Nadzilaha, who married a nobleman called Sergei Pushkin, and they had a son called Alexander Pushkin, who became one of the most famous writers in Russia and wrote a story about his great-grandfather called The African of Peter the Great. And that's the end of the Abraham Hannibal series.